Picture this, you're sitting in a café, eating your favorite chicken pot pie, when a stranger walks up, sits across from you, and whispers, "Are you ready to give up everything to know the truth?" That's exactly what happened to James David Vance in a small diner in Clintonville, Ohio. One question, one conversation, and his life spiraled out of control. Why? Because the answer he gave changed everything. And when you hear what happened next, you won't be able to look away. This isn't just a story, it's a mystery that'll keep you hooked until the very last second. James David Vance was an ordinary guy, 38 years old. He worked as an auto mechanic in Clintonville, a little town where everyone knew what you had for breakfast. He had a wife, Sarah, who taught math at the local school, and a son, Toby, who loved drawing cars. James's life revolved around the garage, where he fixed pickups and tractors, and the daily grind, picking up milk, checking Toby's homework, watching a show with Sarah before bed. Nothing heroic, nothing special. But on Wednesday, October 12th, everything changed. That day, James decided to grab lunch at Mama's Corner, an old diner on Main Street. The place smelled of fried potatoes and coffee brewed since the 70s. He ordered his usual chicken pot pie with gravy, sat by the window, and watched the autumn leaves drift onto the sidewalk. It was a quiet day, the sun barely peeking through the clouds, and nothing hinted at trouble. But then the diner door swung open, and he walked in. The stranger was thin, with gray hair poking out from under a worn baseball cap. He wore a faded jacket and clutched a beat-up notebook. He glanced around, like he was looking for someone, then headed straight for James's table. Without asking, he sat down, set the notebook on the table, and locked eyes with James. "Are you ready to give up everything to know the truth?" he asked, his voice low but piercing. James froze, fork in hand. The pie didn't smell good anymore. "What are you talking about?" he asked, forcing a smile, but the stranger wasn't joking. "I know what you saw," the man said, tapping the notebook. James's heart started pounding. He had no idea what this was about, but something in the man's tone made him listen. "My name's Harold," the stranger went on, "and I know you were there when it happened. Saturday night. On the old road by the mill." James frowned. Saturday night, he'd driven home that way. It was dark, rain pouring so hard the wipers couldn't keep up, but he hadn't seen anything. Or had he? "You've got the wrong guy," James snapped. "I was just driving home." But Harold leaned closer and whispered, "You saw the light. And you heard the scream." James pushed his plate away. Saturday night, he had noticed something odd. Near the old mill, where the road curves, there was a flash of light, faint, like headlights, but to dim. Then a sound, sharp, brief, like a scream or tires screeching. He'd thought it was deer or the wind and kept driving. But now, with Harold bringing it up, his mind started racing. What had he missed? "If you know something, spit it out," James said, but Harold just smirked. "Truth comes at a price," he replied. "Help me, and I'll tell you everything. Meet me tomorrow at 7 p.m. by the mill. Bring a flashlight." He stood, left the notebook on the table, and walked out of the diner so fast James couldn't get a word in. After Harold disappeared through the door, James stared at the notebook. The cover read, in faded ink, "Harold Pierce's Journal, 2003. He hesitated, but curiosity won. He flipped it open and read the first line. "They think it was an accident, but I know the truth, and someone has to believe me." James shut it and stuffed it in his pocket. It sounded like nonsense, but the mention of the light and scream stuck with him. That night, he barely slept. Sarah asked why he was so quiet, but he brushed it off, just tired. In his head, though, one question spun. What did he see by the mill? And who was this Harold? The next day, after work, he grabbed a flashlight, hopped in his pickup, and drove to the old road. It was 6:50 p.m. The sun had set, and fog rolled over the fields. The mill was dead quiet. The old wooden building sagged with age, its windows boarded up. James stepped out of the truck and flicked on the flashlight. "Harold," he called. Nothing. Just the wind humming through the trees. He circled the mill and stopped cold. Harold's baseball cap lay on the ground. Nearby, tire tracks led into the bush. James followed them. In the brush, he found an old car, a rusty sedan, hidden under branches. The driver's door hung open, but no one was inside. On the seat was a photo, a young woman, about 20, smiling at the camera. On the back, in shaky handwriting, "To Lizzie, 2003. A chill ran through James. What was this all about, and where was Harold? That night, James got home and started flipping through the journal. The entries were messy: dates, names, fragments about the accident, and what they hid. One stopped him dead, October 10th, 2003. Lizzie vanished. They said she ran off, but I saw the car. I heard the scream. By the mill. James checked the calendar. Today was October 11th, 2010. 7 years exactly. He started piecing it together. 7 years ago, Clintonville buzzed about a girl who disappeared. Her name was Lizzie Pierce. Everyone thought she'd left town with some guy, but Harold, her father, maybe, believed something else. And now he was chasing the truth. James, he'd stumbled into it without knowing. The next day, he hit the library and dug up old newspapers. In the October 15th, 2018 edition, he found it. Lizzie Pierce, 20, missing. Police find no trace. But one detail stood out. She was last seen near the old road, the same road where James heard that scream Saturday. It was clicking into place. But why had Harold vanished? What did he want from James? James went back to the mill. This time, he brought a crowbar just in case. The car in the bush was unchanged, but when he shone the flashlight on the back seat, he saw something new, a small metal box, like a safe. He tried to pry it open, but the lock held tight. Then he heard a rustle, branches snapping behind him. He turned and saw Harold. The man looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. "You came," Harold said. "Now listen. In that box is proof, but if you open it, your quiet little world falls apart." James gripped the crowbar. "Proof of what?" he asked. Harold exhaled. "The truth about who took my Lizzie, and who's still living in this town." Harold spilled it all. 7 years ago, Lizzie was driving home from work. A drunk driver, Roy Green, a local businessman with a shop on Main Street, cut her off. He hit her car, and it veered into the river by the mill. Roy fled, and the police buried it because he was buddies with the sheriff. Harold saw it from afar, but couldn't reach her in time. For years, he hunted for evidence, and Saturday, he'd finally found it. A headlight fragment from Roy's car, still in the river. He'd stashed it in the box and headed to town, but his car broke down. James had seen him that night, coming back from the river. "Why me?" James asked. Harold met his gaze. "Because you're the only one who stopped. You looked that way. I saw your headlights." James remembered. He had slowed down when he saw the light. But he drove on. Harold begged him to help open the box and take the proof to the police. James agreed. They cracked the lock, and inside was the headlight piece etched with a serial number, a perfect match to Roy's car. But when they drove to the sheriff, it went south. Roy already knew. Someone from the diner had seen James with Harold and snitched. The next day, Roy showed up at James's garage. "You don't know what you're messing with," he said. "Drop it, or your family's done." James stood there, wrench in hand, but didn't swing. He knew Roy wasn't bluffing. That night, Harold vanished with the box. A week later, James got a letter, "Thanks for trying, but this is my fight." James never found out what happened to Harold. Roy still struts around town, smiling in the diner. The truth stayed buried. James went back to his life garage, Sarah, Toby. But every time he drives past the mill, he hears that scream. And he wonders, was it worth saying yes to Harold's question?